Well, hello and welcome to this Barnes & Noble Midday Mystery event. I'm Lee Child, author of the Jack Reacher books, but today I'm here purely as a huge and massive fan of Ruth Ware, who has a new book out that we're going to talk about. Ruth lives in Brighton on the south coast of England, which is not far from my place in England. But today she's in Baltimore, Maryland on book tour to promote this wonderful new novel. And so we're going to join her and start talking about it right now. Hello, Ruth.
Hi, Lee. And I just wanted to say I don't really get too nervous before events these days. I'm sure, you've done enough as well. But I was more nervous about this than almost anything else, because as you know, I'm a huge Reacher fan. I came late to the party, but absolutely love Reacher. Very excited for The Secret, which is out. Is that in October? Is that right?
Yeah, that's out in October.
Yeah, very excited for that. I can't wait to see where he goes next. I really enjoyed No Plan B, as you know, because we chatted on a midday. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I'm glad you're nervous because there's a lot to talk about here, which, and first of all, what struck me as a reader of yours from the beginning is that 0 days kind of turns inside out what you've done before, which was that you had a real specialty in those tight, claustrophobic, closed off, like Cabin 10, a ship on the sea. There isn't anything more isolated than that. And so everything was set in this very defined and isolated world. What in the business, I guess we call a locked room mystery or a country house mystery. But 0 days is flips that completely, because it's not internal. It is in fact everywhere. The setting is all over the place. The action is continuous and wide-ranging, and there's a lot of questions come in that are basically saying, how do you get the ideas? How do you know what to develop? So as a writer myself, I'd be really interested to know, were you nervous about abandoning what you were known for? Was it irresistible to move into this alternative field, or what?
Gosh, I guess the thing is, it was not quite an impulse decision, but when I'm sort of planning out a book, I suppose I don't really think about it in terms of what's my speciality. Of course, I hope that readers are going to like my books. But I didn't really think about this in terms of, I normally, which you're completely right, like what I'm known for is a kind of like locked room mystery type thing, a sort of more classic crime kind of influence, whereas this book, its influences are very much more sort of things like Rogue Mail by Jeffrey Household, or like the 39 Steps. It's kind of much more in that sort of mold. But like lots of people, I got completely obsessed with podcasts during lockdown. When I was homeschooling my kids. Turns out there is a reason why I did not become a teacher, and it's probably a relief to everybody concerned, particularly me. I wasn't able to work. My husband is a virologist, so he was working all the hours that God sent, and I was kind of the one doing all of the homeschooling, all of the cooking, all of the grocery shopping. And to kind of, I guess, to try and sort of keep my brain active and sort of keep in touch with the outside world, I was listening to all of these podcasts. And I already had a lot of tech podcasts on my radar, because I'd written 2 books already that were kind of tech adjacent, I guess. So The Turn of the Key has a sort of nightmarish smart house, which is constantly going wrong. And One by One, which is set in an alpine ski chalet, the core of the mystery is this tech startup company called Snoop, and they've gone for a retreat. So I kind of had all these tech podcasts on my radar, but over lockdown, I sort of found myself sliding kind of to the darker end of the spectrum and listening more and more to things about, cybercrime and the dark web. And over the course of this, I discovered this whole job, career, way of life that I'd never heard of before, which was pen testers. And I had never heard the term before, and it's one that I've now had to explain to a lot of people as I wrote the book. Nothing to do with pens. It's actually short for penetration tester, and it's someone who basically hacks into either secure systems or secure buildings for a living. And the idea is, if you've got a really secure system, you don't actually know how it's going to stand up to an attacker until someone attacks it. And ideally, you don't want the first person who tries your defenses to be a real criminal. So companies hire these people to try to break into their systems, and then they report back and say, this held up, this needs work, here is how I managed to fish this information. And I thought, what an amazing character for a book. And I'm fascinated by people who have, and I guess funnily enough, Reacher kind of falls into this category, like people who have the skills of a bad guy, the capabilities of a bad guy, but they choose not to use their skills in that way. They choose to use their skills for good, to protect people. And the idea of someone who was basically like an ethical burglar, someone who could break into your house, break into your systems, wreak havoc, make a fortune, but chooses not to do that, chooses to use their skills to make people safer. I thought, I want to write about this person. And the character of Jack, I apologize also for, I didn't consciously still reach the name, but afterwards I was like, oh, I wonder if there was a little bit of an influence there. Jack's character came out of that. She's a woman, by the way, it's short for Jacinta.
Yeah, that was another departure, I guess, that she is, a real badass and highly trained, a total expert at what she's doing. A sort of alpha female in that sense, in as much as her husband is technically very accomplished. But she's the one who is crawling through air conditioning ducts and descending from the ceiling and breaking into server rooms and so on. And so you chose a very dynamic, very ballsy character here, which again is not the same as the every woman caught up in something unexpected. She goes out to seek it. And I really felt the vulnerability of that in the opening sequence of the book. She is doing good work. She is trying to show, yes, this is secure, or no, it isn't because of A, B, and C. But she was picking locks and, squirming through gaps and all this kind of stuff, very active in a way that was proactive. She's not just reacting to situations at the beginning.
Yeah, and you're right, that is a real departure from my, a lot of my previous main characters have tended to be just kind of normal, everyday, every women, I guess, who, happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and something terrible drops into their lap. And to an extent, that's true for Jack. She's going about her business, she's doing her day job when something terrible happens in her life, and that thing is the murder of her husband, who is the love of her life. But yeah, she's someone who is, you're right, she's not someone who reacts. She's someone who is used to being in charge, to choosing the direction of travel, to solving problems. And that is both her great strength, in that, it's what enables her to do what she does. But it's also her great weakness in the sense of the plot, because she's not used to sitting back and letting other people decide things for her. And what that means is that when her husband Gabe is killed, initially the police treat her like a grieving widow. They're very sympathetic, but she quickly realizes that actually they suspect her and that they are moving in to arrest her. And at that point, what I would do, what any sensible person I think would do, is sit back and just hope that the police do their job and hope that they find out the truth, hope that they investigate, hope that they figure out that they've made a terrible mistake. But that is not Jack's personality. Her personality is to see danger and to react. And so she reacts the only way she can think of, which is to take matters into her own hands, to walk out of the interview that she's in, and to go on the run and try to solve her husband's murder herself, which to an extent she has tools to do. But it's a decision that puts a massive target on her back, understandably.
Yeah, it was a massive decision for her, and kind of split second, in as much as she had to make that instinctive judgment. And was that based in any way on doubts about the police? Because obviously we sort of know statistically that the murder of somebody, they always look at the spouse, or they always look at a close relative. And I guess statistics bears that out, so that's not necessarily unfair. But she was faced with that instant decision. She knew what was coming, how to react to it. And you said, and probably readers would share the same opinion, well, you'll just sit back, hope for the best, and hope that it works out like it should. But Jack doesn't trust that. Is that based on some doubt in your mind? Because I'm trying to figure, what would I do
What would
in
you
that
do?
situation?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I am so unbelievably law abiding. There is absolutely no, like, I just couldn't imagine myself making the decision that Jack does. I mean, in the book, she has various reasons for doing that. A large part of it is just personality. And I was really interested. I listened to a ton of interviews, read loads of articles by ethical hackers and pen testers, who are incredibly generous actually with their time and their expertise. They'll often talk really openly about their jobs. And one of them said that he thought the defining quality of a hacker was that it was someone, or usually a kid, because often these people start very young, who, when they see a button marked "do not press," they have to press it. And I'm the kind of person that if I see a button marked "do not press," I'm like, oh, well, I'm definitely not going to press that button because it's got a sign on saying "do not press." But I totally get that there is a type of personality to whom that is absolute catnip, and they see something and they're like, I have to find out what happens. And, you know, that is Jack. She's someone who, when she's told not to do something, her instinct is to think, well, screw you, I'm going to do it anyway, because you're probably telling me not to for a reason, and that reason might be more convenient to you than it is to me. But the other reason that she doesn't entirely trust the police is that she has a backstory with a police officer ex. She was in a very abusive relationship with him. She's had various run-ins and misunderstandings with the police, which I think is also something that's very common for people in her line of work. You know, it necessarily, if you're seen poking around a building at night with a torch, you're likely to get arrested unless you can find someone at the company who's prepared to vouch for you, which can be pretty difficult at 3 a.m. You're probably going to end up in a cell. And so she has a sort of slightly abrasive relationship with the police from the beginning. But also, you know, this was a book that I didn't write it during lockdown, but it was sort of, I guess, kind of brewing in the back of my head. And I think that something that's happened over the last few years is our relationship, like societally, to the police has somewhat shifted. There was, I think, particularly in the UK, because our police don't carry guns and are sort of historically maybe seen as quite cuddly figures. People had a real sort of affection and level of trust for the police. And then during lockdown, there was an incredibly tragic case where a young woman called Sarah Everard was basically kidnapped by a police officer and subsequently murdered, using his powers of arrest under COVID lockdown protocols. He claimed that he was arresting her because she was out after curfew or something. And I think it sort of started a real kind of societal soul searching, which in some ways we're seeing playing out in fiction now. I think there's a lot more books that sort of express a sort of more uneasy relationship, a sort of level of maybe a bit less trust. And certainly this book isn't in any way about that case, but I think as a society, we're kind of, maybe grappling a bit about how we actually feel about these people who have huge powers and mostly use them absolutely for good, you know, just as Jack does. But if there is a bad apple, it's you know, it can be a very powerful and very difficult situation to be in.
I noticed in passing, you said you didn't write it during lockdown, and that sounds extremely unsurprising given all the other things you had to do. And I think we should just pause for a moment and say how tough it was, especially on women and especially on mothers, the lockdowns that we experienced. What I had the most fabulous time because, you know, my kid is completely grown up. I had nothing to do. It was a relief just to day after day with nothing to do. But it was awful for a lot of people. And I was really happy that you got this book written afterward, because anecdotally, you know, from friends, I'm hearing that it was so disruptive and so damaging in a way that people's whole approach has changed somehow. I'm glad you survived it. So the next point would be, and this is something that maybe international audiences need to, will be a bit of a surprise. Therefore, Jack is immediately on the run in London, which is probably, well, not probably, definitely, certainly, the most electronically surveilled city in the world. I think people are familiar with the idea if you use your credit card somewhere in an ATM, they will track that. But London is such that you or I could walk 10 miles across London, and probably every single step of the way would be recorded on a camera somewhere. So that Jack is not only making this crazy decision, but she is doing it in an environment that is virtually impossible.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think I've seen some statistics saying that Beijing has more surveillance than London, but it's very, very much like London has to be up there in the top, like 1 or 2 cities in the world as being the most surveilled. And it is fascinating. And I talked to a lot of police officers about, you know, what it's like being on the run from their perspective, you know, chasing criminals, what their powers are. And they all said the same thing to me, which was to watch this British TV show called Hunted, which the premise of the show is basically 12 ordinary people are given, I think it's a really small amount of money, it's like £200 or something. And they go on the run, and then there's a team of hunters who have powers basically equivalent to what the real police powers would be. Obviously, sort of, you know, it's kind of done a bit for effect, and they don't actually have the same legal powers, but it really gives you a very clear impression of how difficult it is to go off the grid in the UK. And the thing about the UK, you know, is it's a small country, our weather is pretty temperate, we don't have grizzly bears, we don't have poisonous snakes, so you can go and hide out in the woods and probably nothing bad is going to happen to you. But the challenge in the UK is, as you're completely right, is simply staying off the grid in terms of, you know, not being filmed. There's facial recognition on many of the cameras. We also have an incredibly extensive network of number plate recognition. So one of the big challenges for people who are on the run is if you use any form of transport with a number plate, you will be tracked. The police, virtually all major roads, and it's very difficult not to cross at least one at some point in your journey. You will be picked up. They can, as soon as you use your credit card, you will be on an ATM. There'll be a photograph of you. So it's a really challenging country to disappear in. And I think it's probably only going to get more so because, you know, at the moment, facial recognition is in its fairly early stages, and there is some level of automatic scanning, but a lot of it is just done by human beings still looking at, you know, screens of rather blurry footage and being like, that looks like our guy. But, you know, AI being what it is, I think in a few years, they'll literally be able to just track someone, as you say, you know, walking shop to shop to shop, and that will be fairly instantaneous. So, yeah, it's a challenge for sure. And it's one that Jack has to grapple with varying degrees of success.
Yeah, it's almost as if obviously she knows what the environment is, and she's quite judicious in risking it at certain times. She's got to do something. She knows that it's going to be tracked, but she thinks that she can get away with it just for that second, because by the time people have reacted, she'll be somewhere else. So it was really interesting to me how she adapted to that reality in a way that began to, she almost used it, especially toward the end of the story. She used it in ways that suited her rather than worked against her.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing is that, Jack's overriding concern in the book, although she is on the run, her main goal is not to stay off the police's radar. Her main goal is to solve her husband's murder, and that's the only thing she really cares about. So she's constantly making a calculation of what will further her aims. This may put her slightly more in danger, but it might get her one step closer to finding out who killed her husband. And so there's always a trade-off, and for her, finding out the truth is always going to win, because ultimately, she doesn't really care what happens to herself. At the end of the day, she's sort of laser focused on figuring out the truth.
The other thing that I loved, and I take this to be a kind of feminine thing, because women are so much more realistic about what happens, is that, she does this tremendously physical escape. A lot of this stuff is not just thinking, but it's doing. And she hurts herself scrambling over a garden wall as part of her escape, part of her evasion techniques. Is it revealed what it is? Was it a shard of glass in the top of the wall, or just a random piece of metal or something? But
yeah, it's never completely. I think you're just supposed to think it's like, those things that people have on to just make it a bit more difficult for a burglar to get over the wall. Yeah, I think in my imagination, it's like a piece of glass that's been embedded.
Yeah, when I was a kid, that was how they would do security for walls. They make a little semicircle of cement along the top of the wall, and they stick in pieces of broken glass. I remember that all over the place.
Broken beer bottles, isn't it? It's cheap, and effective.
And she falls foul of one of those, we assume. And what is it, about 2/3 of the book, she's grappling with a terrible wound, as well as all the other problems. And I thought, Reacher, that would never happen to Reacher.
Well, that's one of the things that annoys me in Hollywood films. The hero always takes a bullet to the shoulder, and I think, my God, if someone shot me in my shoulder, I would milk it for 3 months. I would be in bed. I would have people waiting on me hand and foot. I certainly wouldn't be like jogging through the undergrowth. So yeah, I wanted to have a main character who something bad happens to, and they definitely don't get over it.
I know. I felt verging on the cruel. The poor woman. Her husband has just been murdered, and now she's got a septic wound that is threatening to kill her. She's got the entire Metropolitan Police on her tail, and there's a question that came in from one of the readers, Christine, who wants to know, how do you plant seeds for the reader without giving away the twist or reveal, yet making it surprising? Because I'll be the first to admit, you were very honest in this book. There was no mysterious person showing up at the end who did it all. It was not an outrageous or unreasonable surprise. The answer is kind of there from more or less the beginning, and yet I did not see that coming. So how soon did you know who it was, how it was going to end? Were you finding out, or were you secretly concealing it all the way?
In general, I almost always know the solution to my books. It's the one thing I do know, and actually I don't plot a great deal. I know quite a lot about the beginning of the book in terms of the characters, their backstory. So I sort of know where they start. I don't plan a whole lot in between, but I almost always know the solution to the mystery, or at least kind of 90% of it. There's often bits that surprise me, like sort of specific motivations. This book was no exception, and I think some people will get it. It's not, some of my books, the central question is who did it. That is what I think people will keep people turning the pages. This book, obviously that is a question, but I don't think it's the kind of burning heart at the heart of the novel. I think that is Jack going to be okay? Is she going to be able to get justice for herself, justice for Gabe? And is she going to be all right at the end of it? And I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say that the 0 days of the title has many meanings in the book, but one of the main meanings is that the book is structured as a countdown. It starts at -8 days, and we're counting down to day 0, and 0 days is when the police catches up with her. So we know, that from the beginning that Jack's time is limited and that she will not be on the run forever. And the police will catch up with her, and will she manage to do everything that she needs to do from the beginning? But yeah, in terms of the who did it, the solution was there from the beginning, and I do really strongly believe in playing fair with the reader, in dropping clues, in giving people a real chance to guess it. And I know that, some writers, it's incredibly important to keep that, reveal close to their hearts. And the thing about crime readers is that they're very sophisticated. They read a lot of books. They get very good at spotting a twist. They get very good at spotting when you're trying to pull the wool over their eyes. But to me, as a reader, I would rather feel that a writer has played fair with me, that I had a chance at guessing the mystery and maybe get there a bit ahead of the main character. So that's the way I try to play it with my readers.
Well, and I think it totally works. And as I say, I think the solution to this, the mystery element in 0 days is dead on, completely plausible. You don't feel at all. I mean, there are some books where you think, what? He did it. That's my least favorite kind of twist, when it's sort of just like something completely left field, where you're like, but I couldn't possibly have been expected to know that. How was I supposed to know he had secret triplets? So I try not to play that game with my readers. Exactly, and I think that's quite right. So it is totally satisfying as a thriller. It's totally satisfying as a mystery in that sense. But really, the book is about a woman with intolerable grief. It's an emotional book. It's a book about emotion, even though on the surface, the pen testing is so fascinating. And in a way, I'd sort of heard of it, but I'd never really thought about it that much. So it was a universe that was great to dive into and to experience as a reader. But fundamentally, it was about the crushing weight on this woman who, it was a bad day. Her husband is killed and she's on the run. It was about that, the power of her determination. And yeah, it was hard to see how she could survive in a way that could be satisfactory to her. That part of it, you must have evolved as you went along. You couldn't have known her emotional journey from the beginning, because it's too idiosyncratic, surely.
Yeah, no, very much so. That evolved with Jack as a character. And I think, obviously as a crime writer, I've written about death before, and I always try to do justice to the dead person, because although I love reading classic crime, if I have a bone to pick with it as a genre, it is that sometimes the victims are treated a little bit disposably. You sort of feel that their deaths are only really there to provide a kind of puzzle for the detective to solve, and a sort of impetus for the book to carry on. And in a way, that's partly what I was writing against in this book. There are so many Hollywood films where there's a death of usually a woman, at the beginning, who only really dies in order to enable the hero to go and do various horrific acts of revenge. But it's okay because he's grieving, so it's fine for him to, gun down all of these people or whatever it is. And I kind of wanted to flip that, but at the same time to sort of do justice to what Jack is going through. And I'd never written about someone who loses the love of their life. I'd always shied away from it. I've killed off dozens of other people in the novel, but I'd never written about someone whose life partner dies and how you would go on after that. And I think it's because I felt with Jack, I'd created a character who was, she kind of is a badass. She has this really specific set of skills. She's really good at what she does. She's pretty formidable. And I suppose I felt that she was the one person who needed a really formidable task to be up against. And the worst thing that I could think of was, losing the love of my life and being suspected of his murder. And so, with that chip of ice in the heart, which I think all writers have, I sort of loaded that onto poor Jack and gave her that to deal with. But yeah, I've never lost anyone in the way that Jack loses Gabe, thank God. But I have, had bereavements, and it's not something that you get over quickly. It's not something that you're okay about in 8 days or maybe even 8 years. And I wanted to be honest about that in the book, about the way that people sometimes struggle to survive after a bereavement like that. And that was, yeah, it was tough to write about at times.
Yeah, but it was essential in a way to her relationship with the problem of the police, because she didn't care really, she was facing an awful prospect of being potentially convicted for this crime that she didn't commit, but that was not her main priority. And we sense that as readers. And this was something that I thought was terrific about the writing. We really cared about the two of them, about Jack and Gabe, as if we knew them. But you were pretty light about sketching in the backstory. There was backstory that we understood who they were and where they were coming from, but not the kind of backstory, we don't know where they grew up, we don't know where they went to school. There was none of that kind of laborious backstory. It was very lightly sketched into the point that we cared, but nothing more than we needed. Were you aware of being sort of judicious about that?
I suppose I was, not in a kind of it wasn't sort of something that I sat down and kind of calculated, I guess, but primarily it is a thriller. And I wanted it to function as a thriller. I love those kind of, chase sort of, things like the 39 steps and stuff, where you're really like, it's really in the moment. You're really sort of care about the protagonist. You're following their every move. It's like a cat and mouse game. And I wanted it to function in that capacity. But at the same time, I did want readers to care about Gabe, and that is a huge relief to me, Lee, that you felt that, because it was something I worked quite hard on. Particularly, the first chapter is the only time that we really meet Gabe in the flesh, or hear him, because he's over Jack's earpiece. And that was probably the chapter that I worked hardest on in edits, was to kind of give you a real sense of his personality, give you a real sense of their relationship, because I knew that it was like my one shot chance to get this right. But I also, I wanted him to be a real presence in the rest of the novel, in terms of, Jack thinks back to him constantly. She wonders what he would want her to do. She wishes he was there. But obviously at the end of the day, it's still got to function as a thriller. I still want people to be sort of intrigued and turning the pages. So yeah, bit of this, bit of that.
But to combine a couple of questions from readers, I'm going to slightly alter one. Alison asked, what was your favorite book you've written? And I'll combine it with another one that asks, who was your favorite character? Where does Jack and Gabe, I guess, where do they fit in with the people you've done before? Are they favorites now, or are they just one of several? Or is it a recency thing? This is your new book, so you're all about them. How do you think that's going to work in the future when you look back?
I know. Well, I'm always very jealous of you, Lee, because, Reacher has been such a kind of constant presence in all of your novels. And one of the sad things about writing standalone so far is that you do have to say goodbye to every character at the end of it. And I think about them a lot. I kind of worry about them and wonder if they're doing okay. And, is so-and-so still drinking, and maybe X should have gone into therapy, but probably won't have. And yeah, it's sort of like, friends that you haven't seen for a while, and you see their name come up on Facebook and you're like, oh, I should check in. I wonder if they're all right. But in terms of favorites, I find that question so hard. It feels like being asked who your favorite child is. I love all of my characters, even the fairly crappy ones. I have a kernel of affection for most of them. Um, I guess Jack is pretty up there, I would have to say, partly because it's my most recent book, and you always have like a sort of they're my baby feeling about the one you've just written. Partly because I just loved researching her and finding out about this world that I knew nothing about, and that was absolutely fascinating. I think if I had to pick one character who I would just like to have as a friend, it would probably be maybe Danny from One by One, who's like a secondary character. He's a cook and he's just really funny, really warm-hearted, really amazing friend. I think most of my main characters are so battered and bruised by the end of the novel and what I've put them through that they just deserve to go off and have a quiet life and not be bothered by me anymore. So.
Yeah, Reacher obviously shows up in every book, but the way that he moves on means that the rest of the characters are all new. And I got over it pretty quick as I started to do more and more books. But I remember the very first book, literally crying that I would not see some of those characters again. It's a strange thing, isn't it? That they don't exist, they're made up, but we're sitting there for 6 months with them. And they really mean something by the end of the book.
Yeah, you live with these people in your head trying to figure out who they are and what they want. And it's sad saying goodbye. Do you have a character that you sort of think about, Lee, and worry about?
Oh, I don't sort of worry about any of them because I figure they'll sort themselves out, but I miss them, like you said, as friends. You know what it's like if your friend emigrates or something, or somebody that you've known for years goes to Australia or something like that. There's a certain sadness that you just probably won't see them anymore.
They're out there doing their thing, but not with you.
Yeah. So it's a strange thing, in my opinion, how bound up we get with people that actually don't exist. But then, of course, so do the readers. The readers are, you write standalones. So it's not quite the same, but my friends that write series, you get the book and you know that it's going to be a great story and it's going to be some big crime and there's going to be some very exciting stuff and a big reveal. But basically, you're just thrilled that you're back with these people that are actually figments, but that's how we work as readers, I suppose. It's a fabulous thing. You were a bookseller back in the day, so you must have seen this from literally directly from the customer's mouth as to how they're relating to books.
Yeah, absolutely. I was mostly a children's bookseller. I was actually a very bad one because I just used to recommend all the books I loved, regardless of how suitable they were for the child that I was recommending them to. But yeah, I think kids in particular get so invested in the worlds that they inhabit. And, it's one of the reasons why series fiction does so well for children, because there is that like real hunger to go back and live in that world again. And yeah, the only way you can do it with standalones is to go back and reread the same book. And I don't know about you, Lee, but I am a big rereader. I have certain books that I read at certain times of year. Some people I know never like to read the same book twice, which is also fair enough. Better for us as writers, because then they go out and buy a new one. So
yeah, I'm instinctively, I am a rereader, because when you read something that is just so good, you want to do it again. But I'm also obsessed by what's coming next, what's new. And so it's a constant tension between that. What book am I going to read tomorrow? I've got dozens that I would love to reread, and some of them probably for the 10th or even 20th time. But then you've got the impulse, no, there might be something really great and new that you can get on board with on the ground floor. So, but it's interesting what you said about kids, because I think there's a lot you can learn from children's responses to books. Even the really elemental one is how at a certain age they want the same story over and over and over again every night. And that is significant in a way. Adults don't want the exact same story over and over and over again, but they want basically the same story. And you can learn, I think, a lot of valuable lessons from the sort of untrammeled native reaction that little children have to things.
I totally agree. And fundamentally, I think when we're writing crime, we're sort of almost, it's a bit like fairy tales. There's a shape to a fairy tale, there's certain expectations. Even when the characters are different, there's a kind of resolution that's expected. And it sounds like a weird comparison, but I think in some ways that's the function that crime fiction fulfills in the modern world. We're telling a sort of fable where there's a problem, people strive to overcome it, and there's a resolution. And it isn't always a kind of fairy tale resolution. Not everything is always tied up with a neat bow, but there's some sort of restorative justice in the way that there often is in fairy tales. And I completely agree with you. It kind of fulfills that need to feel the same emotions, experience the same feelings again and again and again, but in a new way.
I also learned from my daughter when she was very little. We used to play this game. I would give her bath at night, and then, she was all wet and soapy, and I would pick her up to get her out of the bath, and I would pretend to drop her and grab her at the last minute after she'd fallen a couple of feet, and she would just cackle with thrilled laughter. And it taught me that people, I think, love to experience fear and peril when they know for sure it's going to be all right in the end. And that's kind of what you're saying about crime fiction. In 0 days, I mean, we are suffering along with Jack, but because it's crime fiction, we do have this implicit promise that it will be okay for her. Hard to figure out exactly how, given the Gabe situation, but it does kind of end up satisfactory. She ends up okay. And that is a huge component, I think, that is revealed by childhood, that we love danger as long as we know it's going to be okay.
I think you're absolutely right. As sort of crime and thriller writers, I think that's fundamentally what we're doing in a way. We're sort of almost dropping the reader and not quite, and saying, and you do that again and again over the course of the book. You're like, here's a scare, but it's going to be okay. Or is it? Maybe not.
I know, it gets worse and worse. And in Jack's case, as we said, against this background of technology that is like a third character always in the story, that it's not just police ingenuity that is going to capture her. She is visible everywhere. And that is, I think, again, a very elemental feeling, that to be visible, to be watched every step of your day is not a pleasant feeling.
It's scary. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I sometimes get asked why I keep kind of returning to sort of tech and technology as a theme. And it's true, it does crop up in a few of my books. And I think it's because it's sort of the Wild West of modern day life. It's a frontier where we haven't really got the rules in place yet. We haven't figured out what we're comfortable with. We haven't entirely figured out what's allowed. The technology is developing much faster than the legislation, as we've seen with chat GPT and all that. Suddenly this new thing is created which isn't really covered by existing copyright laws, by existing fair use laws. And as a society, we're grappling with that all the time. And I think anything that makes us feel uneasy, anything that we haven't kind of quite worked out how we feel about it, how we're going to deal with it, all of that is fundamentally really interesting territory as a writer. And it's certainly the world that Jack is operating in is the sort of slightly murkier end of tech that we haven't, as a society, fully dealt with yet.
That's true. I mean, Jack is she's a lot less naive than a lot of people, because obviously she knows the score on these things. But I mean, me personally, I remember 20 years ago feeling like the internet was this fun thing where you could maybe learn things, maybe change somebody's mind or have your own mind changed or whatever. It was a dialogue. It seemed a lot more honest 20 years ago. And now technology seems to be something that your initial reaction is now, how are they trying to rip me off? How are they trying to cheat me? Which is a sort of miserable destination to have gotten to, isn't it?
I think it is. And I think that was actually something that was really important to me to address in the book, because I think you're completely right. Technology as a whole, and the sort of whole online world of scams and phishing and all that kind of thing, has made us, I think, a lot more suspicious of each other. You know, I know now when I get a phone call, I don't think, oh, hooray, maybe it's someone getting in touch. I think, oh God, it's probably a scam caller. And that isn't a healthy way to live your life, permanently suspecting that people are sort of trying to trick you or fish you or do you down. And on the one hand, that's a world that Jack very much inhabits. You know, it's her job. She fishes people for a living. There's a whole sequence in the book where she basically, for sort of ethical, semi-ethical reasons, she basically scams this lovely woman into giving up her password. I wanted to show that, but I also wanted to be really clear that actually I don't think that is how humanity is. I think there are a very few bad apples out there who loom a lot larger on the internet, purely because there's a sense in which you can maximize your effect by talking to a lot of people. But the vast majority of people are lovely. They're good people. And that is something intrinsically that Jack knows. And it was interesting to me that, you know, when I was thinking about the kind of the precursors to Jack in terms of, you know, the sort of literary and filmic inspirations that I drew on when writing this book, almost all the fugitive novels and films are about men. And actually, when I was researching this, one of the things I found out was that women make very, very successful fugitives and very successful pen testers, because people want to help them. And, you know, if a hulking 6-foot guy comes and knocks on your door in the middle of the night and says, I've been mugged, you're probably going to tell them to go away. Whereas if a 5-foot-nothing woman in visible distress with a baby bump comes and does the same thing, you're probably going to help her. And fundamentally, I think most people are kind, they are altruistic, they are out to help their fellow human being. And that is something that Jack encounters again and again in the book, even as the worst possible things are happening to her, even as she encounters the worst of humanity in the form of the people who are, you know, trying to kill Gabe and menace her life. People keep helping her. There are good people who help her again and again when they don't have to, when they have no reason to. And that is how I feel about humanity. I'm not a super suspicious person.
Well, you're a very lovely person, and I think probably you're right. My experience is that most people act out of goodwill, given the chance. We're almost out of time, but just having referred to fugitive novels and movies that you've seen before, there's a great question here from Sarah Berryman, who asks, if you could sit down and chat with any author from history, who would it be?
Oh, that is so hard. That is such a difficult question. I mean, it's always tempting with these things to say someone really erudite, you know, like sort of Aristotle or, you know, Geoffrey Chaucer, to make you sound incredibly well read. I think probably I'd quite like to chat with Agatha Christie, mainly so I could ask her what actually happened to her in her famous, you know, disappearance when she went missing and claimed to have had amnesia. But I suspect she would probably tell me to sling my hook and would think that I was being incredibly impertinent to ask her about such a painful part of her past. So yeah, I don't know, maybe Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I think he would be fascinating. There's a lot going on beneath the surface in those novels, a lot of Freudian stuff that would be very interesting to chat to him about.
I wouldn't mind that either. Dinner with Sir Arthur, that would be good fun. Well, thank you so much for telling us about 0 Days. It's a wonderful book. Everybody should get it. If you've bought a ticket to this event that includes the book, they're being shipped right now, and you should get them between 8 and 10 days from now. If you didn't buy a ticket that includes a book, you can go to barnesandnoble.com and get the same special edition if you want it. If you want to go anywhere at all, you can. There are many, many other outlets online, and of course your local neighborhood independent bookstore that has 0 days. So make sure you get a copy right now. And once again, Ruth, thank you very much, and congratulations on another just terrific story.
Oh, thank you so much, Lee. It was such an honor chatting with you today. And yeah, I can't wait for The Secret.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Bye, everybody.